When I was young, 40 plus years ago, if people thought about foreign food, they usually were thinking about Europe, French food, Italian food, German, and we had Chinese restaurants. But there wasn't Asian food, unless you were in like New York City or San Francisco. The only Asian food was Chinese food. It's only in the last 20 or 30 years that Americans have started to eat Thai food, and then Korean food, and Japanese food. So we've kind of ended, not really by design, but it happened that way. We've kind of ended our semester by going east. Korea and Japan are two of the easternmost countries from an American or European perspective. And we've also ended it by going to the trendiest, some of the foods that have most recently become popular for Americans. So the last country we're visiting this semester is Japan. There's its simple flag. Japan is a country with an amazing amount of natural beauty, whether that's like mountains and forests, there's the famous Mount Fuji, or designed beauty, as in the famous gardens of Kyoto. But Japan is also a heavily populated country with huge modern cities. Tokyo is, by most ways of measuring it, the most populated city in the world. And Japan is a country that is about the size of California, slightly smaller actually, but with about 90 million more people than California. So a lot of cities. What else should you know about Japan? Naturally, the language is Japanese, and the capital is Tokyo, that huge city that I mentioned. 126 million people in this country the size of California. In terms of religion, there's Shintoism, which goes way back, and that involves things like ancestor worship. That goes back pretty much as far as Japanese culture goes back. Buddhism goes back to about 600 when it was brought in to the country. About 70% of the Japanese people practice each of those religions, but there's actually quite a bit of overlap. There are people who practice both, and yet a lot of them aren't part of any organized religion. Their practice is individual. Okay. Geographically, there are many, many islands. You can't see most of them in a map like this because a lot of them are smaller. And then the big ones that you can see. This is part of what's called the Ring of Fire. We're on that too, right? At least closer to the coast, the west coast of the United States, and all the way down through South America, and then through here. It's called the Ring of Fire because of volcanoes. So Japan was formed by volcanoes. It is a mountainous country. The largest mountain is the famous Mount Fuji that I already mentioned. So about half of the country is mountainous. And there are forested areas. The climate is temperate, not exactly tropical, closer to subtropical or temperate. But it varies a lot as you go from north to south. And it is hot in the summers. And like a lot of Asia, they get a rainy season in the summer. And they are subject to typhoons, which is their word for hurricanes. They also, because of the volcanoes, have a lot of earthquakes. All right. The economy of Japan, it is the third largest economy in the world. It's a huge economy. It is part of the G7, right? That group of nations that kind of makes big decisions and arrangements for the world economy. They have one of the largest stock markets in the world, and so on. They are also, interestingly enough, the largest creditor in the nation in the world. Creditor nation means a nation to whom money is owed. But at the same time, they have the biggest debt, at least compared to their national productivity in the world. So they're a highly in-debt nation, but many nations are in debt to them as well. In terms of their economy, they make cars. They're one of the largest auto manufacturers in the world, one of the largest electronic manufacturers in the world, and they're getting into high-tech stuff like robotics. Just a little bit about their history. So civilization came to Japan when rice was brought to Japan and people were able to start living in larger numbers. That was a few hundred years before Christ. Japan became unified in about 250 AD, but which group was in power shifted around and the capital moved around several times over the centuries. Finally, around 1600, Tokyo became the capital. And it was also around that time that Japan really tried to isolate itself from the rest of the world. Prior to that, there had been a lot of influence in terms of culture and religion and food and so on from China and other places. But from about 1600 until the 1800s, Japan tried to lock itself down. And then the British actually kind of forced them in the mid-1800s to open their ports and start trading with people. And they started having interactions. And eventually they started getting more militaristic. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they had war with Russia, they had war with China. Finally, in about the 1930s, you already found out before that they occupied Korea in 1910. Starting in 1930, they started moving into parts of China. They had ambitions to become the power in Asia, which eventually led them to attack us, make a preemptive strike against the United States by bombing Pearl Harbor in 1941, World War II. 4 years later, we know how that ended. Japan is the only country in the world ever to have atomic bombs dropped on it. Part of the peace arrangement coming out of that war was that they would not have a military, and they haven't had one since, which has, I suppose, helped to free them up to put money into things like automobiles. And so they've had a long period of economic expansion with some bumps in the road, and right now they seem to be headed into kind of a recession. But for the most part, they have had economic expansion, which is maybe partly why their culture has also gotten to expand some. We are influenced by things like anime and sushi. Let's talk about Japanese food. The basis of Japanese food, as with all Asian cultures, is rice, of course. And Japanese food was originally influenced mostly by Chinese food, so there's some overlap there. But after they opened up to the West, starting in the 1800s, they started trying all different kinds of food. So if you're in Japan now, you can get any kind of food you want. And in fact, they're really good at it. Japan in 2011 surpassed France as the country with the most 3-star Michelin restaurants, the highest rating that Michelin gives. Great restaurants, apparently, in Japan. So what kind of food do they do? Traditionally, it's light on meat because there are a lot of Buddhists in Japan, and a lot of Buddhists are vegetarian. And even the ones who do eat meat usually don't like to eat 4-legged animals, so they'll go with birds or fish. Light on oil and dairy, and heavy on salt, because soy sauce is like one of their main seasonings, and miso, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So, speaking of flavors, there's a word called umami, and it's like a 5th taste, right? We can taste sweet and sour and bitter, and there's one other that I'm going blank on now, but the 5th one is umami, which is like savory. And this usually comes through a broth. So, and then they use soy sauce a lot, They use sake, which is a wine, and mirin, which is a rice wine. And they also use rice vinegar and other kinds of vinegar. They use sugar and salt. That's in their foods. On top of their foods, they'll do things like ginger or wasabi, that really spicy horseradishy kind of topping. Pictured here. Be careful with that in restaurants. All right. So I said I'd talk about miso. Miso is, you make it into a paste, but it is fermented soybeans with salt and some kind of fungus and sometimes other ingredients. So they make it into a paste with miso soup, which is a staple in Japanese food. They put that in a broth, a savory umami broth, with whatever kinds of ingredients they want. So that's a staple. Sushi, of course, is the best known and the most popular food from Japan. And many of you are doing that this week. Tempura is like a batter that you make, that you coat vegetables in or whatever else you want, and then you deep fry it. So traditionally, the Japanese cooking didn't involve a lot of oil, but now they do some deep frying, and tempura is quite popular. They also do different kinds of noodles. So you have udon noodle soup or soba noodles, ramen, familiar to college students everywhere. This is what it's actually supposed to look like. They do eat a lot of fish. They're surrounded by water, right? And they drink a lot of tea. So those are some highlights. And some of you, I know this week, are going to get to make sushi, and I hope you have fun with the ingredients and maybe come up with some toppings or a dip and enjoy it. It has really been fun trying to introduce you, however briefly, to different countries and seeing the pictures of the food that you're making. I hope you have a great week. God bless you.